So what was it that you felt you could bring to the table that was different? Because you had Freddie Lakers, you had Oasis Hong Kong, even AirAsia itself, you had to license the brand from them because they didn't believe in you.
Well, ultimately for me, number one, it's the curiosity to look at things differently, to challenge a lot of assumptions. But I think number two, very important as a leader, is how do you paint a compelling picture that convinces people who have the real experience and industry expertise to come on board this mission to go along the ride with you, because you can't tackle these problems by yourself. Right? And so you do need to rely on people who are much smarter than you. But our job as leaders is to convince them why they should leave their established organizations and join you on crazy missions. And so that's part of what we have to do, right? We have to be very compelling. We have to be very persuasive. And if you assemble the right team and you excite them enough about this idea of doing something that no one in the world has ever done before, then I think that's a big part of where the magic happens.
So once you had that right team, how did you go about figuring out a model that was sustainable?
Oh, I think ultimately it took us years to really understand, how do you create a sustainable airline? Now, of course, a lot of people will immediately, and they have every right to say, but AirAsia X never figured out, because they only look at it from an external, overall consolidated. But I think internally, because we could look at, for example, the profitability of our business by individual routes and destinations that we flew to and which types of planes, we found and we were very clear what drives profitability, right? In this case, you can only be profitable in markets where you're the number one player. So you got to choose which markets to compete in, and you have to play to win. You can't play to be number two or number three. So what does that mean, right? That means it's better to be a big fish in a few ponds than a small fish in many ponds. And once you figured out the formula, we then embarked on this pretty massive restructuring exercise. We pulled out of Europe. We canceled our London and Paris routes. Most people thought, oh, see, they're withdrawing, so long haul doesn't work. Actually, it's not about the distance. It has nothing to do with the distance. It has everything to do with better, for example, be the number one airline flying into Australia or Japan or Korea, instead of, one flight a day to London, when Emirates by themselves have 8 A380 planes flying to London every day. Right? So you got to choose where you play, and then you've got to win. And when we were able to demonstrate that model and execute that model, we were able to convince pretty sophisticated investors in 2013 to say, okay, I will buy your IPO shares because your explanation makes sense. Right? And so ultimately, to me, the validation is not just because I think low-cost long-haul can work, but we were able to build a case and convince very sophisticated investors that, yes, it can work. Now, ultimately, of course, 2014 became, no one predicted 2014. Within less than a year of our IPO, the whole aviation sector went upside down because of what we call black swan events, right? Things that are highly improbable, but when they happen, they have massive impact. So March 2014, MH370, a plane went missing. July 2014, a plane was shot down over Europe. And then in December, a plane was lost en route from Indonesia to Singapore. And all of them, while they're not AirAsia X, they had a tremendous effect on our market, specifically out of China and Australia. Demand plummeted by double-digit rates, right? In the first year as an IPO or public listed company, and actually never recovered from that. So that's life. Like, you can go through the hard work, figure out what works, what doesn't work, convince people, and they give you capital. But yet, who would have predicted 2014? Just many people didn't predict it 2020, right?
But even before 2014, I mean, it seems as though you were hit by unfortunate incidences all the time, beginning with 2008 financial crisis.
2009, 2010, 2011, 2012. That's how I lose all my hair.
So tell us about 2008, because that's when the oil price went crazy, right? And it really impacted.
Well, yeah, because we launched in November 2007. And literally just a few months after we launched, the world turned upside down, because first you got to deal with the global financial crisis, where banks who have even signed agreements to provide financing to you all pulled out, hung up to dry, right? Trying to how do we even survive this without financing? And at the same time, you're dealing with that crisis, another crisis built up, which was oil prices. Now, for an airline like ours, oil is almost 50% of our cost, right? And oil went from, if you think about it, 2007, you put a business plan together, right? How do you decide what's the price of oil in your model? You look back and you see, 2002 to 2007, oil was about $50 to $70 a barrel. Let's be a bit conservative and call it $75 a barrel, which is what we put on business. And in the first 6 months of 2008, it almost doubled to over $140 a barrel. And this is where, again, airlines started panicking. And what do boards and investors tell you to do? Hedge your fuel, right? What does hedging mean? Hedging, people say, well, it mitigates your risk. Actually, was meant to be a risk mitigator, turned out to be a risk creator, because by fixing the price of oil, on when you say, okay, no more volatility, right? Let's say oil is now $90 a barrel, and you go to the bank and you say, I don't like volatility. I want to cap my price of oil for the next 12 months. Okay, $100 a barrel, fixed price. Right. And then, of course, after that kept going up all the way to $140 a barrel by July. And you're like, wow, I'm really smart, right? I took away the volatility. I avoided all this. Then from July to December 2008, it crashed all the way under $40 a barrel. And you've locked in your price of oil at $100 a barrel. So just dealing with those issues was just insane, right? Like, again, nothing that's ever been written in textbooks, no one could have anticipated it.
I mean, 50 airlines went belly up, but you didn't. So how did you pull through?
I like to use the term sheer dumb luck, because it just so happens that the bank who was the counterparty to our fuel hedge, they went bankrupt before us.
And then before that, you actually secured this meeting with this European export credit agency in London. And that was sort of like the pitch of a lifetime for you. Can you share a bit about that experience?
Well, so remember when I shared that early in the year, the banks who had signed our legal agreements to provide financing all pulled out, right? So now there's no more financing, no more financing. How do you get planes? No planes, no airline, right? And at that point, the last lender of last resort was the European credit agencies, because they wanted to support European exports, in this case, Airbus, right? Because if we can't buy Airbus planes, then of course Airbus are also not going to be in a good position. But the European export credit agencies usually have a rule, right? Like they only provide their credit guarantees to airlines with a 3-year profit track record. Number one, we've been in business less than a year, and we're definitely nowhere near profitability. So first, just somehow convincing them to just even give us time for one meeting was already very hard, but somehow we did it. And I remember flying up to London, preparing for this presentation, taking the London Underground tube, their office in Canary Wharf. And while I'm in the subway, you can see most people are reading newspapers, right? And the headlines of that newspaper was literally another long-haul, low-cost airline had just gone bankrupt. Because remember, airlines were going bankrupt one after the other, right? I'm like, okay, so here I am going to the export credit agencies to pitch why they should support us, a fledgling long-haul, low-cost airline with no profit track record, when just that morning, another one had gone bust. So I thought that was really ominous. But, this was the last chance. There was nothing else, right? If they said no, and they had every right to say no, that's it. It would have been game over for us.
What do you think convinced them to say yes?
So I honestly don't know, because I remember that day I was just really just running on adrenaline. I have no recollection of what I said, because it was just all adrenaline. And I remember after that, where I look at this committee, they're very stoic, no expression. They say, we will come back to you in a few weeks. Okay. And you go back and you're like, crash. I don't know what I said. And 6 weeks later, they did come back and said they will provide us guarantees. Very difficult terms, but at least it was a lifeline. So that's life.
I feel like, in what you've shared so far, it's very clear. No matter what plan you've made, it just doesn't work out. And so that's probably why you always say, I don't have a long-term plan, but you want to be flexible and nimble all the time.
Because you have to. It's not by choice. The world dictates it that way.
I loved some of the things that I noticed during your tenure. One of the things was that you were really prioritizing the fact that information was flowing up to you to ensure that you would be nimble to respond to things that other larger airlines would not be able to. Can you give an example what that was like and how you ensure it went up? Because you scaled very quickly to 2,500 staff. That's a lot.
That is a lot, right? And it's one of these things where you learn somehow naturally, silos get formed, right? People start to not talk or communicate, or it only happens at certain meetings. So information has to go up before it can come down. So number one, that is very slow and very inefficient, right? And so as a leader, what I learned is number one, you can't just say, oh, come to me if you got a problem. No one's going to come to you. Or if you just go and try to say hello to everyone, management by walkabout, at best you'll just get, oh, everything's good, boss. Like no one's really going to stop you and then have a deep conversation with you. Or if you have a town hall meeting, right? You say, all right, guys, this is the plan for the quarter. Any questions? No one's going to put up their hand. And so as a leader, you can't say, oh, well, I've done my part. It doesn't work that way because there's still a lot of issues and problems and frustrations on the ground. They're just not coming up to you. So therefore, as leaders, we have to figure out what would it take for us to get in there and bring the information up. And so that included things like having what I now call honesty hour sessions, basically just forums where you provide your employees the safety of anonymity, where people can say anything that they want completely anonymously and confidentially. Like either they just write it down or we use anonymous Google forms, but then like real unadulterated problems start to come up. Now, the first few times you do this, people may not believe you. They may not trust you. So they may not bring up much. But what they're really doing is they're testing you to see how will you respond if they just throw a small problem at you. Because a lot of times leaders, right, when an employee throws a problem at you, your first reaction is to be defensive, to explain that problem away. Oh, well, the reason why we can't do it is because we don't have enough budget. I'm waiting for this approval or that. And so if you take that position, next time the employee is going to, oh, what's the point of surfacing issues because I'm just going to get blown off. But if you're committed to the process and you're committed to win over the trust of your employees, to say no matter what the issue is, even if it is like, I'm upset because we ran out of cookies in the pantry, and you take that problem seriously. And if that were on Friday, by Monday, the cookies are all stocked. So next time around, the employees might go, okay, let's try a slightly bigger problem, right? So it comes back to the first principle I said earlier, which is you've got to earn trust as leaders. You can't demand it by just the sheer position or authority that you hold.
Wasn't there example of the aircraft staff was saying that there were wheelchair people on the plane?
Oh, that story.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, because again, it's a good example of a problem that I never knew existed, where like a flight attendant started to complain that when her flight ends, she arrives back at the airport and she's got to wait until all the passengers disembark before she can leave. But if there's someone in there who needs a wheelchair, and it's quite common, 1 of every 3 flights, someone does need a wheelchair, and if that wheelchair is not there at the door, and if it takes longer than 5 minutes, if it's like 20, 30 minutes, the wheelchair is not there, you can bet the passenger is going to be very upset. And guess what? The passenger is going to start scolding the flight attendant through no fault of him or her, because it's another department's responsibility, the ground operations team. And so first, it was through this process that we discovered it. We had no idea it even existed. Second, I have no idea how to solve it. But by bringing it out in the open, then you start to realize, well, the ground operations team start to get defensive. They're like, look, it's not our problem. We don't have enough budget, not enough manpower, not enough wheelchairs. We can't be at the gate, at every single gate. Because, as they say, we can have a plan, but the flights don't come exactly on time. So you got to move around. And so we've got to tactically reallocate our resources, our very limited resources. And sometimes some gates get missed for 15 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So if you want us to solve it, give us more manpower and more wheelchairs. Well, okay, if that was the only way to solve every problem, which is just to throw money at it, then, obviously you're not going to be able to be very successful in business. But that's also where, because we create the right forum where people from other departments heard about it, and they said, one in particular, the engineering guy said, hey, interesting, we never knew you guys had that problem, but here's an idea, which is, doesn't matter whether the plane is early, on time, or late. When the plane comes in, what will definitely be there when the plane comes in is the engineering van, because in the engineering van is the guy that holds the 2 lollipops, right? When the lollipops cross, the pilot knows, press the brake, the wheel will stop exactly on this line painted on the tarmac. Lollipop man puts thumbs up, and the aero bridge will fit nicely on the door. So the engineer said, what if we kept a backup foldable wheelchair in the van? So that if ever the main ground operations wheelchair is late, flight attendant, get the backup wheelchair, sort your client out, your customer out first, they're happy, and then let the ground operations team catch up. No one thought about that as a solution, because we always, in our organizations, we just think within our own resources, right? Ground operations doesn't think about that being a solution because the engineering van is not in their department, not under their P&L.
Another one I noticed you said before is that you didn't wait for customers to make decisions. You went to their face and told them to fly to places they hadn't dreamt of. How do you do
Yes.
that?
Well, I mean, to me, it's this whole concept of you have to create demand. Because if you only wait for demand to happen, you will always be reactive. And I guess for me, probably the thing that really brought this concept to light was our route to Chengdu in the Sichuan province in West China. Because when we started flying, most Malaysians had never heard of Chengdu. When they think about going to China for a holiday, it is Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, right? Like Chengdu, what's there in Chengdu? And consequently, for over a year, that route lost a lot of money. And I had a lot of pressure from my board, like just stop flying there. You're losing money with every flight. But somehow I kind of felt like if only people knew about what you can do in Chengdu. There are panda bears, beautiful places like Jiuzhaigou, the Sichuan cuisine, right? Incredibly, so many things, but you've got to like really communicate that out and figure out how do you create demand that didn't exist there before. And eventually Chengdu became one of our most profitable routes because it was always full of people going to Chengdu or coming in from Chengdu. But it took a lot of 18, 24 months to make that work.
What were the things that you found most effective in creating that demand?
As a marketer, what I've learned is we're actually not very smart. We can't imagine or put ourselves in our target audience. Traditionally, marketers always thought, right? Like, oh yeah, we're smart. We look at research and yeah, this is what our customers need. But actually, I'm a believer now in the saying, like, you can't know for sure. But let's try so many different things and then just see what works and what doesn't work. And I think this is also why 2008, 2009, then the internet had just started. So you could now run many experiments. And that's the power of advertising over the internet. You don't need to just have many billboards or TV commercials, but you can put different ads, different messaging, different creatives and see which ones work. And then you adjust and you reallocate your marketing spend to the ones that do.
And one of the things that I've noticed as well is that you also made some mistakes. There was a $50 million mistake with the in-flight entertainment. Can you share with us about that?
A lot of mistakes. I mean, that's just one tiny example. But the point is, when you try to do something new, when you try to do something that no one else has ever done before, it is impossible to always get it right. Like many organizations, if you don't tolerate failure, right? And so you must get it exactly right, then you launch. But then you lose out on speed. So ours was a philosophy that, look, just try quickly 10 things. And even if 8 out of 10 fail, that's okay. We move on, we learn. So one of the many examples was we thought we would be the first low-cost airline in the world to have full in-seat, in-flight entertainment screens in the back of every economy seat. So if you were actually in an AirAsia X plane, not AirAsia, AirAsia X plane, 2008, 2009, you see these, not just the regular in-flight entertainment screens, but then things like touchscreen was quite innovative. It even had instant messaging so that on the plane you're bored, you kind of like that person on row 13G, you can send a message, hi 13G, I'm at 17F, nice to meet you. That part was popular. You pre-order your meals, so you don't have to wait for the flight attendant to come with a cart to ask you what you want. You can just kind of select your meals. That, again, good idea in theory. Turns out though, it became a terrible customer experience because number one, you learn people don't want to eat at the same time. They just eat whenever they feel like it. And when they do buy, they want it now. They don't want to wait 15, 20 minutes. But the problem then becomes, okay, if all your orders go straight to the galley and the flight attendant now has to go, 14G wants a Coke, 13F wants a hamburger, 22D wants chicken rice, right? And then 17C wants nasi lemak. Suddenly the whole system kind of just fell apart. Customers were upset, even the flight attendants were upset. But the single biggest reason though was we thought, hey, we've got in-flight entertainment screens. Maybe we can put in TV shows and movies that people just pay a small fee, let's say $5, $10. Would they watch movies? Turns out there were actually many people refused to pay money to watch TV shows, right? But yet every single flight, every single screen, every single movie title, you have to pay a royalty fee to the Hollywood studios. So now you start the flight with this fixed cost from all these royalty fees. If you can't sell enough, you're going to lose money. But if you set your price too high, less people will be willing to pay. You set your price too low, you can't cover your costs. And we end up losing a ton of money just from the TV entertainment systems, let alone all the issues about food ordering and all of that. And so we ended up having to scrap that whole system. It was a $12 million US write-off. So that's about 50 million ringgit down the drain.
you were trying many, many different things and you scrapped those that don't work, but you also needed to run for a time to see whether it would or would not work. So how do you balance and juggle those different initiatives and then decide, okay, it's done. This is not going to work. It's time to change.
Sure. That's a very good point. And I think as a leader, here's what I learned. Number one, very hard to evaluate an initiative on a standalone basis, right? Like, because sometimes you just got to be resilient. You got to persevere, keep being creative, right? Find a way around all the obstacles. But at what point do you call it quits? So what I've learned is, while it's hard to evaluate on a standalone basis, it is easier, not easy, but easier to do it on a relative basis. That means if I stop doing that, do I have a better alternative? I need to be convinced that it's a better alternative, better use of my time, my focus, or my team's focus, our capital, our resources. So you need to develop a better plan B. Then it's time to switch.
So you definitely figure out some things that most certainly work, like the low-cost airline flatbeds. And I think Singapore Airlines initially said, oh, this is not going to work, not bundling entertainment. They even hired your commercial director in the end because they saw it worked. So how did you stay ahead of the curve when all your competitors were watching you and copying what you were doing once they saw it worked?
That's okay, because by the time they copy, that means they're looking at what we've already done. So the only way you survive is you're working on the next thing, right? Because even if they heard, oh, wow, they launched this service, okay, it'll take them a few months to launch it. But you've already got like 2 or 3 things that you're already in your pipeline. So they'll always be behind you if all they do is they copy. And that's why I'm not a believer in this whole, let's do industry benchmarking, let's look for case studies before we do something, because that means you'll always be a follower, right? Like, I think you've got to have the courage to do new things that no one else has ever done.
So you're doing all this and you achieved a lot because you IPOed in June 2013 with a $1 billion valuation. So how do you end up moving again to a totally new industry, iFlix?
Well, I think what I learned is that the things that I'm good at and the things I'm bad at, right? I'm probably better at the early stage, the ideation, the willingness to try new things. But when something becomes very big, like $1 billion company, that's publicly listed, that's got audit committees and risk management committees and much more conservative because you have something to lose, they probably by then need an adult to run it. And I'm the crazy kid that just keeps rocking the boat. So time to pass the helm to kind of more responsible adults. And when I caught up with my former friends, Patrick Grove, who's the founder of Catcha and had this crazy idea of building iFlix, didn't take a lot to convince me, right? We just paint a crazy vision. Like, I'm all for it, right? Let's do it.
I think it started with this Monday morning conversation in Starbucks with Mark Britt, right?
It was coffee. It was in Bangsa Shopping Center. It's not Starbucks. I can't remember where. Maybe La Bodega then. I don't know. But yeah, it was just one coffee meeting. And then that afternoon, we went over to Patrick's office and we just started brainstorming, a whole bunch of stuff on the whiteboard. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to sign up. Let's do this.
What was it that allowed you to make that decision? That this is what I want to jump into next?
Again, it is when at least you have this vision in your head of something that doesn't exist before that could have a big impact, right? And I think one of the key insights was in media, you realize there are all these gigantic media companies, but they actually are very parochial. They're like big in Malaysia only, or big in Hong Kong only, or big in Singapore only, because media had always been very regulated, licenses and local ownership requirements. That's why media was always a local industry. But the internet now gave us the opportunity to truly democratize it, to be able to access any consumer from Dhaka, Senegal, all the way to Denpasar in Bali. And so that meant suddenly, instead of, for example, buying content for 30 million people, you can negotiate with Hollywood studios to buy content for 1 billion people. Very, very different economics. No one had thought about serving the mass market in emerging markets that way. So I'm all game for crazy things. So I jumped in.
And so you started in 2015, you had few people, laptops, no product. What was the game plan to kickstart iFlix?
I don't know whether we really had a plan. We were just constantly firefighting along the way. I remember initially we were like, okay, I think we can start in March. Oh no, missed that deadline. Let's start in April. Oh, missed that deadline. Let's start on 1st of May. Oh, missed that deadline. 15th May, missed that deadline. But 26th May, 2015 at 6 p.m. we went live, mainly because number one, you do pretty tight deadlines. You try, knowing that, okay, if we fail, but we learn from it and we move on, right? It's that willingness to just kind of go fast and build basic version number one. And basic version number one of iFlix was pretty crap, but we just want to just put it out in the market, quickly test it out, and then keep iterating, keep relentlessly iterating.
And was local content something that you were considering that you really wanted to produce? Because I think 50% of content budget went into original productions.
Oh, I don't think it was ever that high, 50%, but it was significant. Yeah, we wanted to. We knew it was going to be very distinctive, mainly because the whole iFlix proposition is to address that mass market segment. For example, in Malaysia, if we sit here in Kuala Lumpur and fancy places like Bangsa or Damansara, right, you think, oh, football is English Premier League, right? Everyone is either a Manchester United, Chelsea, Liverpool, Arsenal fan. But actually in Malaysia, for every one person that watches English Premier League, 4 to 5 people watch Malaysian football and they don't connect. So it's a completely different segment. So simply pushing Hollywood means you only cover the segments in Kuala Lumpur, but you're going to ignore the segments that are much, much more larger and much more local in their requirements. So that is why we felt it is important to be distinctive with local content. But the thing about local content is there's not a lot of it existing immediately. So you've got to like produce stuff on your own, and that's hard. You can't do it immediately. Right? It just takes a long time to build it up.